Welcome, welcome. We are live, and I am honored that you all would share space with us this evening as we talk about the subject when punishment isn't enough. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with my guest, but I'm gonna let her introduce herself. So why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, Bobby. I'm so glad to be here and to connect with everyone watching now or in the future as well. So, yeah, my name is Marlee Liss. Pronouns are she, her. I come from a background that brings a somatic educator lens, a social worker lens. Personally, I bring a queer lens, a Jewish lens, and then definitely what shapes my work the most is lived expertise, as it is for so many of us. And yeah, we'll definitely share more. I'll share more about my story in depth, but just in a nutshell, yeah, after experiencing sexual violence, I ended up fighting for a restorative justice outcome for many different reasons that we'll dive deeper into. And it was healing beyond what I knew was possible. And I experienced that after having gone through the punitive court process for 3 years. So the kind of contrast between those two processes just really blew my mind and made me really passionate about this. And that's kind of when I became full-time advocate and speaker on this topic. And I've had the privilege now of going to universities and conferences all over the world, sharing my story, sharing this advocacy work. And yeah, again, I'm just so glad to be here with you today. And your work is amazing, Bobby. So I'm stoked for us both to share our perspectives on this.
Absolutely. It's interesting to think about, and you're going to share in just a moment about that, but like your journey, because I think about my work within the schools. And I think about being a school leader and talking to educators about restorative justice, restorative practices, what it means in schools, and how it can help.
Mhm.
Um, and typically we have very, I'm going to say, different understandings of how we arrive at what discipline really means, what justice really means. Um, and so people will say to me, well, restorative practices don't work.
Mm.
And I always turn back to them and I talk to them about, okay, well, is it working now? Like, is the
Mhm.
suspension, is the detention, is the write up what we presently have? Is the push out process of education working? And I think that it bears parallels to what we see in the world. And that is not to say that we should not be accountable, but it is to say that punishment itself doesn't seem to be enough. And I would love to kind of get your thoughts on that and then kind of weave in your story for folks who may not be familiar. Part
Yeah.
of your story. Let me be careful with that. Part of your story.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, again, I'm so happy that we're both sharing because I do think we're speaking about the same topic on different levels, right? These different
Right.
layers of the same thing. From the micro, like we can have restorative justice woven into the micro in terms of our interpersonal relationships, our friendships and everything, but then it can be woven into these mesosystems like schools and workplaces and then these big scale systems like what I'm talking about, the criminal legal system, the justice system for big scale crime. And I totally relate to what you shared about people kind of saying, hold on, this doesn't work. And I really get where people come from with that because we're so trained from the day we're tiny little babies to be so carceral and punitive and
Mhm.
to equate justice to punishment and to kind of not question that. This is just the way it is. Suspension, detention, canceling our friends online, boycotting people, whatever, all these things, right? So, yeah, I think it's a powerful thing when, like you said, we stop, we take a moment, and we ask, is this actually working? And if we look at the statistics around any of those different layers I just mentioned, punishment often isn't actually happening, even though we think that it is. That might be more true in my realm of things with the legal system and sexual violence versus your realm. You would have more insight into that. But a lot of the times with sexual violence, with the justice system, punishment isn't happening. Rates of acquittal are 99.03%. That means
Mm,
it's almost never happening, even if we think it is. And then there's also an assumption that if and when it is happening, it is working. And when we look at rates of recidivism of people causing harm again, we see that no, punishment isn't actually an effective way to prevent harm, to stop harm. Actually, what it often does is just kind of ping pong style transfer harm back and forth rather than eradicating it. So I'm totally with you on introducing like restorative justice as an alternative to that punitive approach in many areas of life. And then, yeah, and then you mentioned just sharing about my story as well.
Yeah.
Did you want me? Yeah. So, yeah, in this short, I can share obviously when we condense these life journeys, we truly condense them. And I never want to minimize the impacts of trauma. So that's one reason that I say that. But yeah, so I experienced sexual violence from a stranger back in 2016, and it really changed my life more than I realized it would. I was studying social work at the time. I had to drop out completely. I was dealing with panic attacks. At some points I wanted to take my life. Like it was immensely difficult, and I didn't know that restorative justice existed at all, as many people don't. We don't have that representation on the media. We don't see that at the end of a Netflix true crime doc or whatever. So I didn't know it existed. And so I sort of went through the motions of what you're told you're supposed to do after rape. And that meant that I went to the
Mm.
hospital, I got a rape kit. I was asked if I either wanted to report to the police or do nothing at all. And those were the two options I was given. So no one's
Wow.
mentioning a third, an alternative. And so my sole motivation for reporting was that I didn't want nothing. That's it. I didn't have an idea that this would be my liberation, be my healing. I was just like, I don't want nothing. So I went through that process, and it's a mark of privilege that I even went through that process, because we know that so many people are dismissed right away, especially marginalized survivors, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous survivors dismissed right away. But I did go through that process for 3 years, and it was horrible. I think often we hear that courts re-traumatizing, and I would even go as far to say that at times it's abusive, because it's
Mm.
running on the idea that the defense is going to show that I'm not credible by breaking me, by cracking me, by causing me to have an emotional breakdown. Like, that's pretty extreme. And so I was devastated by that process. I was disempowered by that process. And I was just like, how is this going to do anything to stop rape in the world? Like, how is this gonna change anything at all? So by the time I was subpoenaed for the criminal trial, it had been 3 years. And my very first thought was, I'm gonna drop the charges. Like, I don't wanna do this, and I don't see the point of doing it either. And I thought about doing that for like a week, and I just kept bawling my eyes out. And one of my friends was like, hey, it doesn't seem like this is what you want. Like, you're so upset. And she kind of asked me this question that no one had ever asked me, which was just, in your dream world, like, what would justice look like to you? And I kind of described a restorative process without having the name for it. I said I would want accountability. I would want to be authentic and real. Like, I'd want to show up as myself with all my emotions and everything. I'd want to voice the impact without having to fit this like perfect victim narrative. I want him to actually do the deep work that it takes to change and not do this to another person. I'd want him to take accountability. So she kind of just like encouraged me as the great friend that she is to try and make that happen. So that's when I started doing my own research, because no one had told me about it. And I think like anyone listening to this can really reflect on the role that we might play in directing people towards this, because I'd connected in those 3 years with advocates, nurses, rape crisis centers, educators, lawyers, crown attorneys, therapists, and not one person ever said, hey, it seems like the court process is causing you a lot of pain. Here's an alternative. Such a
Mhm.
simple thing to do. So that's kind of when I found restorative justice, doing my own research and started fighting for that, advocating for that, meeting with crown attorneys. And it was a very polarizing thing to ask for. So some folks were really on board, some folks were not at all. But eventually, with some different incredible people involved, we were able to make it happen. And my assailant started therapy right away. He went to therapy for about 7 months, and then we eventually met in a restorative justice circle process, a process that's rooted in Indigenous communities, and it was healing beyond what I knew was possible. Like, I didn't know you could experience that level of closure and healing after violence. I didn't know that was even a possibility. So it just completely blew my mind. And when I walked out of the circle that day, I thought about how I felt after the courtroom, and it was such a huge contrast. It was like night and day, and I just felt so clear, like, at the very least, every survivor needs to know that this exists. And so I chose to be loud about it. I went to the media, and a few months later there were like 6 different articles, Forbes, HuffPost, some big platforms, and I started hearing from survivors, like, literally all over the world, and people sharing their stories and saying, like I had, "I didn't know that this existed. I wish I knew about this." People saying, "I did go to the police. I was dismissed. I wish I knew about this." People saying, "I endured abuse for years because I didn't want to go to court. I wish I knew about this." People saying, "I did go to court and it tore my family apart. I wish I knew about this." So all of these different stories, like, really became the fuel for me to do what I do now, which is sharing this story and this advocacy over and over again until everybody knows that it exists, understands it on a fundamental emotional level, and B, has access to it if they want it.
As you were sharing, I could hear folks who are, maybe it's new or they're resistant to this type of response to harm, because just like you're saying, we've kind of just been socialized and
Mhm.
indoctrinated into carceral understandings of what justice could look like, right? So what would you say to someone who hears your story and says, listen, I respect, first of all, let me pause, thank you for sharing, right?
Mhm.
um I never want to minimize, or I never want to gloss over any type of trauma that one has endured, has to survive and choose to make their way back from. Right. So I want to honor that in the space and also say to you, thank you for sharing. I know that you shared in other places and things like that, but I don't want to take this for granted. So I want to thank you for that.
Mhm.
Um, in addition, I want to say, as I think about it, right, like if God forbid something like this had happened to family members, loved ones, people that I deeply care about, I imagine myself in that situation. And while I am a restorative justice, restorative practices advocate, while I believe in how we can reform and restructure schools around what this could mean in terms of how we interact with each other, what our world can mean, in that moment, I don't want to escape the emotional context. I'm mad, I'm fuming, somebody's got to pay,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so I don't want to escape the emotional context of it, because I imagine that people who are listening would find themselves in that same place listening to your story. Oh, no, no, we can't do that. Somebody has to pay for that.
Totally.
So talk to me kind of about how you navigated that yourself. I'm sure there were others around you saying those things, wanting those things, and kind of how you arrived at this process as being, what you needed to move forward.
Mhm. It's a super interesting conversation, and thank you for sharing that gratitude, by the way. I'm grateful to be able to share it with you and everyone listening. Um, it's such an interesting thing, and this is one of those, like, answering with more questions than answers, but I
Yeah.
get curious about what is our instinctual fight response and what is, like, our patriarchal conditioning as well, because what I have noticed is this kind of, not always the case, but often, this kind of gender divide where I find that, like, the women and non-binary people in my life, this is just my experience, right? Um, were mad, but they were able to be like, "Oh, like, if this is what you need, then that's what if this is what you need to be okay, then that's
Mhm.
what really matters." And I found that a few of the men in my life responded more so with, "I'm gonna kill the guy. Like, what's his address? I'm driving over. I'm gonna go kill the guy." And I think we've been so taught in a patriarchal context to conflate violence with care. And those men saying,
Mm.
"I'm gonna kill the guy," under patriarchal conditioning, my response is supposed to be, "Wow, thank you, like, you really care about me." Um, but what's truer to me is that I didn't need that. Actually, I was so traumatized by violence in general and so devastated by the ways that we dehumanize one another in the world that more violence and more dehumanization would have hurt me more. And what I really needed was for the violence to stop. I was like, I don't want to live in a world where we treat one another like this. And
Mm.
so it would have made things worse if those men in my life heard what I wanted, heard my boundaries, ignored them, and did a violent thing despite not having my consent. Wouldn't that just be recreating the dynamics of trauma in general and the violation of consent and boundaries that I had already experienced? So I think that even though it might not be in line with what we've been taught, and it also might not be in line with that fight response, that anger for someone whose loved one has been hurt like this, that anger is so valid and it deserves an outlet. Go to a boxing gym. I don't know, put on, like metal music and rage. Like find those outlets for sure. But if you are really there to support your loved one who's been through this, ask them what they need and have the humility to let that outweigh your own trauma response, your own emotional response. And that is survivor centered care, right? I think that's the most meaningful thing we can do for each other is to turn to one another in those hurt moments and say, what do you need right now? And even if that's not what I would need, that's not really what should take the forefront right now. Like, you matter. Let's give you that care.
Yeah. You bring up such a profound um, counterpoint, even like challenges my thinking in the moment. And I want to say this. I say this pretty often, but I want to say it even now to name that I think that there is a notion where folks who talk about subject matter and people who are advocates of things that they've arrived, that they're at a place where this is something that they teach others. And I always say if you are listening to someone who always has advice for you, but never tells you where they're personally being challenged and they're growing and they're learning and they're unlearning, I say you need to follow somebody new.
Mhm.
And so I want to name in this moment that push to think about violence in terms of care um is one that I'm taking with me even now. Like
Mm.
that's challenging my thinking.
Hmm.
Um and I think about the point that you brought up, and that is survivor centered care, right? In restorative practices in schools, on in the school side, we talk about it in the terms of who who are those affected, who is harmed, and what are their needs. Because
Mhm.
typically in schools, when you hand out a suspension, when you expel a kid, when you hand a detention, that the whole interaction takes place between the one who committed the harm
Mhm.
and you, the principal. What it
Right.
completely leaves out is those who have been harmed by the offense. And
Mhm.
so their voice is completely wiped off the map. And now you are the judge, jury, executioner for all things that happened to the person who did the wrong. They don't have a chance to come face to face with the harm that they've done. Oh, hold on. I forgot that thing happens. Okay, we're back.
There we
I
go.
they don't have a chance to come face to face with anything. They don't have the chance to, see folks who they've harmed and look them in the eyes as the person recounts the story or tells them or shares. They don't have, and we're not asking the right questions. Like, we're not
Mhm.
asking the people who have been harmed, what does justice look like for you? And then navigating in a communal sense towards what that reality could look like. What we're saying is we're just going to go ahead and exact out this type of punishment according to some code of conduct that isn't written for the people who are actually in the building. So
Mhm.
I find that very, very interesting to think about those threads one to another. And so my question from that is, if we're going to reframe justice to have survivor centered, or those who have been harmed, their needs centered, what do you think that changes in how we seek out justice,
Mm.
even on those micro and macro levels like you talked about?
Yeah. Again, I think it's so powerful to have the 2 examples of school, like, I'll often reference schools because especially when talking about responding to sexual violence, it's such a controversial, taboo, emotional, huge, like, daunting topic that often people, like, freeze a little. They're like, "I don't know how to," and when we put things into the context of, like, a low stakes conflict or experience of harm in a grade 2 classroom, not to minimize that, like, I'm sure some serious examples of harm happen as well, but as lower stakes example, I think it helps people get
Hmm.
it. Like, I'll often kind of talk about, like, imagine a girl is pushed down on the schoolyard and every single person runs after the person who pushed her and she's left bleeding on the ground. That would be a ridiculous scenario. Like, we'd be
Yeah.
like, sure, maybe one guy should go after the person and make sure he's held accountable. But someone's gonna turn to her and be like, "Oh my god, are you okay? Like, are there any serious injuries right now we need to tend to? Like, what do you need right now?" And we have those instincts, right? We're not apathetic to that, hopefully. So I think it's as simple as that. It's like that person was just hurt. I think we have to really challenge our punitive the way we've internalized the punitive system, in different scenarios because we are just so trained to leave that girl bleeding on the ground and run after
Mhm.
the person who caused harm to find quote quote adequate punishment. And in doing so, we completely turn away from the person harmed and we usually neglect their needs. And if we look towards research and if I look towards conversations, DMs, disclosures, I constantly hear that the deeper need from survivors, and of course, we're all different, but some of the most common ones are um, I want to make sure that this person doesn't do this again to me or anyone else. That's the most common, which I actually think is a really beautiful um, um, I don't know, point for humanity. It's like that we have this kind of natural, like, I don't want anyone else to have to go through what I went through, or I don't want to go through this again. And if we really value that need, if we really listen to it, it shapes our actions completely differently. It doesn't shape us beating up the guy who caused harm because that's not shown to decrease violence. It's actually shown to make that person more violent. Because then, if we look at the biggest drivers of violence, of what causes someone to cause harm, it's usually exposure to violence, isolation, shame. So if we're like, let's put all of the ingredients together that we know will make someone more violent in the hopes that they'll stop being violent, like it's just, as the youth say, the math isn't mathing, right? So
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
like we got to do something different. And I think we really have to take a needs based approach where that need the survivor expresses, I don't want this to happen again, shapes the pathway of justice that we take.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, to your point, I think when we look at any situation where there's harm that has been um, that has occurred, we tend to have a very, I'm going to say, finite. That's not the right word I'm looking for, but we don't look at it from all the angles of from which harm occurs and how it affects people, right?
Mhm.
Um, in in school, we're talking about um, young people who don't see like so I'm in middle school, right? I've been in middle school, been tired of my career. So they're like 5-year-olds and big bodies. That's just how it works. And um while I love my babies, what winds up happening in school is they only see themselves and they don't see how what they did, what they said, what they shared, the actions that they took affected so many because
Mhm.
there's almost a normalized sense in which, oh no, that's just how we do things, or that's just how that person responds to things. So we don't tend to see beyond ourselves. So self kind of gets in the way of actually truly viewing harm. But here's the part that's not as frequently shared. It's not
Mhm.
just the students that do this. It's the
Right.
adults in the building too.
Mhm.
Things that are shared, said in front of the classroom, the ways in which we might belittle children, the ways in which we might call a restorative conversation restorative, but it's really performative. Like, I'd rather say this thing while the administrator's coming down the hallway. I'm going to say this thing to the administrator in front of the kid so the kid really knows how I'm feeling. But all I'm really doing is like belittling the kid in front of somebody else, right? Like all these things come into play. And so my question then for us, and we could toss this back and forth, is the mindsets, the paradigm shift that's needed to embrace this type of approach that looks at harm, right? And tries to deal with it at its root versus answering violence with violence, answering
Mhm.
harm with harm. There's a paradigm shift that's needed.
Totally.
And I think about, well, okay, well, one, what is that paradigm shift? Where do people need
Mhm.
their thinking challenged? And then the secondary question would be, um, how does that so it's always paradigm and then practice, right? So
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
paradigms need to change, and then what practices you think changed as a result of that?
Yeah. Great question. Love these questions. I'm like, "You must be such an amazing principal." I'm so I'm so happy that you're in that role. Well, people speak different languages, right? Not just English, French, whatever, but, like,
Absolutely.
research mind, like, really logistical, logical, um, more emotional, so I think there's many different things that would catalyze those paradigm shifts. I really do believe, and this is why I do the work I do, in the power of storytelling, because I think, like,
Yes.
and again, the research backs this too, right? Like, the power of representation is so real, but listen, I'm a feelings person. I grew up in dance, and I was like, "Yes, I wanna win first place, but my main goal is to move the audience to tears." That was always my goal, and I feel the same way with this work because, I mean, I didn't have this insight when I was little, but now it's because I believe that emotions catalyze change so
Mm,
much. And a
mm,
great example I have of this is sharing my story. Doing this work, I had the opportunity to speak to a courtroom full of judges. And it was actually the first time I'd been in a courtroom since I was in court for this assault. So it was a big deal to me, right? And I shared my story to this room full of judges, and one of them was very, very skeptical, right? He had this classic justice equals punishment. This is the way we do things. He was kind of leaned back, arms crossed. You can feel the energy radiating off him, sort of like, I don't want to be here. And by the end of me sharing my experience of what I felt in the courtroom versus what I felt in the restorative circle, he was actually crying. And he shared with me, I've been um, doing this work for so long. And for the past 3 years, every time I leave the courtroom, no matter the outcome, I feel nauseous. And I haven't known why. And now I do. And this is showing me that we do need to do things differently. And so
mm,
it was the emotion, I think, and the representation, the storytelling, the not just speaking about this in concept and statistics, but actually hearing it from a human being and witnessing the emotional impact that it had. and having our empathy activated, relating to that experience, whether it's through what we've lived or our loved ones have lived. And that was incredible to me because I was like, yeah, it's emotion, it's storytelling. And I do think that media is such a powerful um, place to invoke paradigm shift for that reason, because I see it all the time and I share my story again and again and again because I see people break down in tears and say, like, I feel like I've been waiting to learn about this my whole life, or
Mm,
this makes so much more sense. And so that can that can catalyze a paradigm shift. And for the people who are much more math oriented, statistics oriented, learning about the failings of the current system and the research around what restorative justice can do can also catalyze a paradigm shift. There's so many people I speak to who are very staunch punitive stands. Okay. They're very like, punitive system is the way that we make change. It's what makes us safe. Right. And when I bring out that one statistic of the punitive system, 99.03% of the time results in acquittal. So nothing at all for sexual violence. It's like, oh, it's actually not doing what we think it's doing at all. So I think that combination of like statistics, research meets story, human beings, yeah, there's so much to it because I'm like, it's also reclaiming our belief in transformation because we've sort of been taught to be complacent with this idea that people cannot change, to be complacent with hopelessness. And yet, I'm sure all of us can say, I've changed, or I've had huge journeys, or I used to be an asshole when I was like this. And then I did this and this and this. And now I've changed, right? Like we can all pull out those stories. So
yeah.
I think, I think there's so much that contributes to that kind of paradigm shift, but I would love to hear what you think too.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I think happens is, and you bring this up kind of just in your talking and sharing about it, is when we consider how the needs of those who are harmed and justice is not really on their side. Like justice isn't looking and centering them.
Mhm.
Um, I think that I could see that thread weaved in school.
Right.
So, for example, we haven't considered, right? So you're talking about that statistic about how much is just acquitted when we're talking about sexual violence, but also how re-traumatizing is it to then, if I may, getting a rape kit, right?
Mhm.
Going through all of those invasive measures to try to then at least put enough out there. Like you have to relive the trauma
Yeah.
with potentially people who don't have that type of understanding, level of care, love focused in terms of how they operate with you. It could be very matter of fact, and yet you're supposed to just do this thing because that's what's required of you in
Mhm.
order to get some semblance of justice. And no one, it feels like no one stopped to say, okay, wait, is this really the best that we can do for those who are actually affected? And in the same way, I look at schools and I say, is this really the best we could do? Is I think about like the carnival games, right? And in um the water gun games where you kind of shoot the target and the balloon kind of fills up and pops, and the first one to do that wins the game. And if you look at that, I feel like it's like an analogy for what we do in schools, and some similar to what you're sharing. We will push out the problem somewhere else until it explodes in that other place, out of that location.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and so I would say, and I want to toss it back to you on this. I, I want to say that if we're not going to center the needs of those who have been harmed, then it stands to like we have to ask ourselves the question: who is being centered?
Mm.
Like presently, who's being centered by the systems that we have in place that are saying that this is what justice looks like?
Mhm.
Um, And I would love to say I have an answer for that, but I really don't. And I think it's a fascinating question for those who are listening or those who will listen to this replay. Like, who is being centered presently in justice? and
Right.
why? And who's being
Yeah.
pushed out?
That is a really interesting, like, big question. And, yeah, I think it's interesting because it's not often the perpetrator is centered in a way because we're giving them more of our attention. We're saying, "How do we find an adequate punishment for them?" But we're also massively dehumanizing them. And so often there's a victim offender overlap too. How often is the person who's causing harm acting out because they're experiencing harm as well? It's been normalized, it's the only representation they have, it's a trauma response, like, and they haven't had any help, support. So, that's one factor. So, I don't think we're necessarily centering the perpetrator, but we're definitely directing our focus there. And I kind of think in terms of centering as something that's like comes with benefit, I kind of think we're just hyping up the jobs of the people in the judicial system. We're just like, you're doing your job great, like almost it's like a game show, right? And how often do we hear people saying, I've heard this a lot, people who work in the justice system, who are very set on a successful law career or judge career, and they say, I would never let my kid anywhere near this system, anywhere near this courtroom. And so the values aren't aligning, but it becomes this capitalist workplace game. So I don't know if that's really the answer. There's probably like a lot more layers,
Yeah,
and I'm going to sit with that for sure. But I think
yeah.
the analogy you gave is so potent because it's true. We're just transferring harm back and forth. And there's a great book by Kazu Haga called Healing Resistance. Have you heard of it?
No, but I'm
It's
writing it down
great.
right now.
It's great, and, he says, this might not be word for word, but when we focus so much, when we put all of our focus on one individual, we let all the systems off the hook, and that's
Mm,
something that I really felt when navigating my case was, okay, even if, quote, quote, "best case scenario" in the eyes of the courtroom, my assailant is incarcerated, what changes? Rape culture persists, toxic masculinity persists, people experience sexual violence every day. It's not like there's one perpetrator who is the driving force behind all sexual violence. Like, rates of sexual violence have not declined in over 20 years. Like, this
mm.
problem is persisting. So we need to take that zoomed out lens, hold the person who caused harm accountable, but recognize that there's a lot that needs to be tended to that's complicit in this harm. Maybe it's one of the teachers at the school who's reinforcing degrading language and power dynamics, right? Like, there's so many different people that shape people. We're not just like individual actors or bad seeds that, like, I don't believe anyone's a bad seed who's just born as a horrible human. So yeah, I think I don't even know where that started and where that went, but it's kind of
No,
where
no.
us.
It's good because, for example, there's a lot of there are a lot of resources in schools spent on the perpetrators of harm. Right?
Mhm.
Those who have enacted harm, there it is your time, it is uh, sometimes it's those who are caring and loving towards students will still see the humanity in those students, and then they are spending time and care and resources and then money and then attention. And if something happens within a school setting that um, whether it be a disagreement between two parties, whether it be a full blown uh, fight or potential of a fight, there are a lot of resources allocated to solving that. Um,
Mhm.
but it's more band aid
Yeah.
than anything else. It's Tylenol for the headache, but what you really have is you need an antibiotic, right?
Mhm.
It's And so when I think about, what you've just shared, I think about the fact that that understanding of justice pervades how even um, teachers interact, principals interact with those who have committed harm. Their humanity is lost now. You are only as good as the worst thing that you have done. And I need
Mhm.
to make sure that through my punishment, you know never to do it again or that it won't be tolerated here. And I think that there are layers of accountability that can happen, particularly while these babies are in their formative years, to help them understand, so that we're not just dealing with repeat situations over and over again because we never dealt with the root cause of the issue. You know, I say this pretty frequently, um but I remember playing, old school Nintendo, right? And playing Mario and playing, uh, it was Mike Tyson's Punch Out, right? And
Mhm.
old school Nintendo was weird because like you didn't have a save button, and then if you got far enough, if the game overheated, you had those lines across the screen, you could never see anything, right?
Right.
Um, but if you got to a certain point, if you were about to beat the game and the game overheated, your if you hit the reset button, you start all the way back at the beginning. There was no save progress. It booted you right back.
Mhm.
My point of bringing that up is I think that that's what happens when we deal with folks who are the offenders. The progress is lost. We only see them as value based as the latest thing that they've done, and so we don't hit the reset button and restart and see their humanity. We just kind of compound those things, right? So it, there's there's a sense in which the paradigm that needs to happen is we need to, yes, first and foremost, value and center the needs of those who have been harmed and
Mhm.
ask them what justice looks like. And then two, remember the humanity of those committing the harm,
Yeah.
because the hope in transformative justice is that we are people who are always in process, that we are growing, that we are changing, and that through the actions uh, of of a beloved community, that folks can be around those who are going to push them to be their best selves, hold them
Mhm.
accountable to being their best selves, and doing that deep inner work that you talked about. And
Yeah.
so I want to ask you a question that I think is going to be helpful. You've arrived at this place um after your own journey, trauma and experiences. Um if we could go back in time before any of this occurred, how would you describe your journey and how you viewed anything related to justice, right?
Mm.
And then how you see it now, right? If
Mhm.
you could kind of talk about that journey for us a little bit, I think it might help those who are grappling with the same things and wanting
Mm.
to at least give a chance to what we're talking about.
Yeah. Such great questions. I'm like, I've done like 300 podcast interviews. I'm like, these are such great, like, I love when it goes to this place of kind of like meta philosophical, like how do we see the world? How do we want to be in the world? Well, one thing I just want to say first is
Mhm,
I think we have these instinctive questions that are really good questions that come up for us. And something that a lot of us say when we say our friends, like, oh, I'm dating this person and they did this and it's so annoying. And we instinctively say, why would they do that? And if we really take the time to ask that question, why would they do that? And I think that kind of complements what you're talking about humanizing the person. And I connect with a lot of survivors of trauma, a lot of people who are experiencing crisis, and words like humanizing, forgiveness, compassion are I resonate with those words. They can feel really far away, which is
mhm,
valid. I think a doorway to any of those things, compassion, humanizing, is contextualizing. And so that means answering that question, why would they do that? Are they on
mhm,
a sports team where they're taught to man up every day and push down their tears and never show any weakness, and puffing up their chest is a way to assert their power in the world, and if they don't do that, then they're going to be beat up, right? Like, why would they do that? What systems are involved? What conditioning? What other messages have they received? What have they been shown in terms of how we treat one another? So I just wanted to add that contextualizing piece, because For me, it wasn't that I was like, I'm on a journey and I'm setting out to forgive my rapist, and we're going to sit in a circle and come to a place of peace. Like, that's not, that's not where I was at
Mhm.
after trauma. And obviously, when I speak about it now, this was back in 2016. I speak about like the rape that I experienced was back in 2016. So I spoke about it very differently then than I would now. Um, but what I did feel very connected to, so it was not that forgiveness, not that kumbaya vision or whatever. It was confusion, which to me
Mm.
is an aspect of grief. So there was grief and there was devastation and there was confusion. And quite simply, my needs connected to those things were I needed clarity in response to confusion, and that's shown to be one of survivors' most common needs. The research shows that survivors' most common needs are often accountability, reassurance this person won't do this again, and a coherent narrative, which means we can make some sense of what happened. We can ask those questions. What were you thinking in that moment? Why did you do that? Right? So I had all those needs, and that to me was connected to my healing and what I needed to heal. Because of the way that we're taught to think about justice,
Mhm.
I didn't have any kind of relationship to justice. Like many of us, justice my whole life was this colonial shaped concrete box that included courtrooms, gavels, swearing on the Bible, like these weird things, right? So I had never taken the time or thought I had the um, option even to say, what is my relationship to justice? What does this mean to me? Because it was already predefined. And we can relate to that in so many other ways. I can relate to that with my queerness. It was already predefined my whole life that I would end up as a straight girl with a man, right? And it took me a long time to say, hold on, what is my relationship to my sexuality and all that, right? So
Mhm.
same thing, it took me a long time and a lot of healing and a lot of community support, um, to say, "Hold on, what is my relationship to this?" And if I take it out of its pre-scripted, societally colonial scripted box, um, I take it out and I really reflect, then what is justice to me? And so I didn't do that. I didn't ask myself that until the age of 24 when I was already 3 years into a punitive process, right? So I
Mm.
think most of us don't. When we're given these very dominant scripts and told this is the way it is, end of sentence, we don't get the opportunity to reflect and say like, well, what is this actually for me? What's authentic to me? And that I think is so tied to the title of this platform of liberation, because it's like if we try to shove ourselves into those boxes, that's oppressive. If we step out and say like, what, if it was my world, if I could make this match with what I actually need to heal, to be okay, to be a safer, more empathetic and healed person in the world. What do I need? So a huge part of this for me was giving myself permission to allow justice to be synonymous with my healing. And that's a
Mm.
standard that I don't think any of us are encouraged to have. In fact, I think we're discouraged from holding that standard, and we're taught to be complacent with justice is going to oppose your healing, and that's just the way it is. But when we set this new standard of no, my healing and my justice should catalyze one another, then I
Mhm.
think things completely shift.
Um, as you were sharing, I, was reflecting on things that, I see at not just an interpersonal or an individual level, but I see them, um, I'm going to say across different mindsets and ideologies, right? One is, even as I continue to unlearn the ways in which, misogyny and patriarchy has kind of done a number on me personally, and unlearning those things, unlearning how I show up in the world, and what space I, ensure others have, because, right, like, there's this, shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, there's this intersectionality with how we show up, right? And so, yes, I am black in these yet to be United States of America, but also I am a man benefiting from these systems and ideologies that are in place. And I think about that in relation to the young people that I have that I get to lead and serve and love. And one of the questions that comes up for me is, how am I challenging them to see their world more accurately, see themselves more accurately, right? So that the school and the classroom serves as a window and as a mirror, right? That they see their
Mhm.
world clearly, but they also see themselves clearly in light of the things that we're challenging and pushing them. And so I wonder, on this side of, as we're getting to the end, or we're at the midpoint of March, and I'm thinking about Women's History Month, and yes, this should be an all year thing, right? I think about the transformative power of what we're talking about, and I want to zoom out to a macro level and think about and center just for a moment, when we if we talk about women in and femmes in our society, and we talk about the transformative power of restorative justice. If you could just kind of freedom dream with me, what do you think could be potentially the effects of, if we were to do this, if we were to really live this out, what could change for women and femmes moving forward if we actually did this?
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Um, I mean, I don't wanna be too, like, "This is the way," about
Right,
it, you know what I mean?
right.
Um, but I do feel quite clear on the punitive system being not the way, at least in terms of how it's done right now. The level of
Mhm.
dehumanization that's justified and supposedly required in order to quote, quote, "get justice" is violent. Um, so I think what's possible, I mean, well, in many ways, and I feel very, and I am very privileged saying this, is like I feel like I've lived what's possible because I
Mhm.
actually experienced such deep healing and trauma-informed care, and I had my needs centered, and I was held by community, and I felt completely reassured and confident that my assailant won't do this again, and not only that, but I feel like so much hope in the fact that the ripples of that circle and the work that he did goes out to his friends. You know, he had his best friend in the room that day, and that one friend broke down in tears, said he's never cried in front of anyone before, said that it was the most life-changing thing he's ever experienced, and it's gonna change the way that he shows up in relationships, and if he ever parents, it'll change that. So to me, um, there's immense ripples of our healing just as there's immense ripples of our trauma. And in the punitive context, in that carceral framework, I do feel like we are, like, again, ping-ponging trauma and pain back and forth, and we're
Mhm.
only putting more force into each serve, like, it's, like, only making it worse and worse and more painful. And, in contrast, I think when we disrupt that violence and we focus on not transferring harm, but eradicating it, we instantly create a safer world, a more empathetic world. Again, rates of sexual violence have not declined in 20 years, in over 20 years. They're the only they're the only type of very violent crime that has not declined at all consistently in over 20 years, at least in Canada. And yeah, and so safety. Safety,
Right.
I think, would be possible. Um, Humanizing one another would be possible, I feel. Breaking cycles of not just trauma in our lifetimes, but intergenerational trauma. I think this would shift um, trauma through systemic violence and oppression as well, because of the degree of empathy we're learning. I mean, part of this is flexing the muscle of empathy that so many of us have been taught and trained to be disconnected from. And so, if all of us become so skillful in flexing that muscle of empathy to the point that it becomes habitual, we don't even have to do these things of, how do you think they might feel? If that was you, we just habitually do it. Um, to me, that creates a world. And I know I am a reckless optimist, but it creates a world that's more loving, that's safe, that we're not navigating violence. I think, even like in so many nonprofits that I've been a part of, we talk about lessening violence. And there's an amazing woman, Necker McGregor, who talks about, no, her mission statement is to eradicate violence, not just lessen it. And she's had people say, oh, that's a big mission. Are you sure you don't want to change the word of your mission? And she's like, no, we want to eradicate it. So I think we have to believe that's possible. And I think that the actions we're talking about are ones that operate on the belief that it can be possible, or that it's the rule and anything else is the exception, which is the reverse of what we're currently taught.
Absolutely. Um, you know, when we think about, like you said, what's possible, I think about um m- for men to embrace and understand that they don't need to define masculinity on anything that is anti-woman.
Mm, yeah.
Um, to for us for and I see it in my schools, right? Like they're using slurs to define, what they won't be about. That's and then they say those words. And I struggle with it because I know it's coming just from a place of hurt and a place of confusion and a place of, just a lack of assurance. And so you're just kind of going around hoping that you find what sticks, right? I think back to my experience, right? So um, for those that don't know, and I'm sharing this for the first time with you, like my past is one of adoption. My biological mother left me on a doorstep, um, and so that doorstep happened to be a nurse. So I bounced around the foster care system. Then my mother took me in, um, and then even my adopted father told my mom he didn't want anything to do with her or me, and held true to that promise. So like, there's a lot of rejection in my story, and I bring that up to say that I went around trying to find or define masculinity for myself, what I
Mhm.
thought being a masculine man was, and a lot of it was based upon how I could dominate or have power or how I could manipulate things in my favor, and there was nothing tied to that actually truly made me feel better. It was fool's gold. And it wasn't until I got around other people who love me enough to see beyond that and challenge me that I actually began to see that for myself. So I say that to say, community happens when I make your problem my problem. And I think that one of the issues when it comes to restorative justice, restorative practices, is that we do these things without first building a caring community. So what am I really restoring you to if you don't care about the thing that you are involved in, right? If you don't care about the people around you. And so I want to say that to preface this question. For you, there and I think you might have some pushback here, and I'm welcome to that. I want to know how your community rallied around you, right? And I would love to know, um, for those who might be listening, who might have stories of harm,
Mm.
whatever it might be similar to yours, it might not be, um, and are looking for another way, like you talk about. What would be your advice to them, knowing your journey?
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that window into your story and what you've been through, and kind of so powerfully tying that into the way that masculinity exists and is shaped and reshaped in the world. And I think when you said, like, we have to make my problem your problem and vice versa in order to really collectively heal. And I agree with that so much. And I think it is the case. I think that, of course, men are privileged within patriarchy, but I think that privilege comes with a lot of pain. And I do
Mm,
think that patriarchy harms men to such a huge degree, isolates men, puts them in
100%.
that perfect scenario to make them either violent towards themselves or others. And that hurts me and it hurts you, and so on. So I think that's such a huge part of that. And I have such a powerful image of sitting in the circle, because I was just talking about this and seeing my assailant and his best friend there, and them both crying together as he talked about what he had done, and them saying, wow, we've been best friends for like 10 years and we've never done this. We've never, like,
Mm,
you know, and that was huge. So the circle felt transformative in those reasons as well. Like, wow, we're touching on something much, much bigger than ourselves. Um, so now I forget the question you asked me in terms of kind of like advice to those
advice
who are
to those who, yeah,
Yeah, oh, yeah, and something you worked into that was this notion of community rallying around me, right? And I feel very grateful that I did have that. I had friends who cared and didn't perpetuate these harmful sort of like it was your fault myths and stuff like that. I had people
yeah.
who cared, but I'll also say not only did I have people rally around me, but I also had people own that they were impacted by the ripples of this. And that
Mm,
became a part of the healing, right? So my mom was actually in the circle, and she wasn't just there as someone supporting me, she was, but she was also there as someone who had her own questions, her own need for closure. Her life was changed by this. It was the first time in her life that she admitted she needed help, because, I'm her baby. Like, she was so heartbroken by this. And it's what set her on a path of going to therapy. The circle, she'll always say, changed her life because of the closure it brought her and me as well. And she's actually 62 years old now. She's doing her master's to become a therapist. And she'll say that the circle is the catalyst for that. So, again, that's an example of the ripples that can happen from this. Um,
yeah.
but in terms of advice, I mean, I don't even know how I feel about the word advice, because I feel like it implies like I'm the teacher and I know best. And I'm like, no, I think my advice in a sense is that each of us knows a lot about what we need actually. Um, and I think having the courage and support to take words like justice out of that societally shaped box, to take it out of that box and say, what does this mean to me? Um, is a huge part of how we can find liberation. And that means a higher standard. That means saying, like, I do deserve healing. I do deserve a version of justice that truly matches up with my needs. My needs do matter. So, whether we're empowering ourselves to feel and believe and act upon those things, or the people around us, um, the two biggest moments in my whole journey, I think, um, were or the most pivotal moments, I guess, the most empowering ones were my friend asking me, what would justice look like to you in your ideal world? And then it was one crown attorney saying a similar thing of like, what would you want? And so I think if we're able to validate our needs enough to act upon them, to even voice them, then that can really, really, really start to shift them. And to just challenge these ideas that are just, um, I'm like, I can't think of a word other than like crap. Like, these ideas that in order to quote, quote, get justice, we're going to have to be what much more dehumanized, and we're going to have this miserable process. And that's just what it has to be. It's like, we really should take a moment to put a question mark on that. And I think when we sit with those things, reflect on these things, journal on these things, talk with our friends about them, listen to conversations like this, it can really help us take those words, those concepts out of those boxes, um, and get embodied, get embodied in a sense and say, like, what does this look like to me? What do I want to feel? What would allow me to
Mm.
feel the way I want and need to feel? Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of vague, but I think it's a thing I really wish someone had empowered me to do earlier on, and a thing that I'm very grateful that people eventually did.
I want to thank you as we round out our time for spending, time on such an important topic. And I think that folks who are listening might have more questions. I hope they do. Um, might want to kind of set their own path on, well, where can I learn more about what it is that you two are talking about? Um, and so I want to round out our time with this final question for you: is one, how can people get in touch with you, support you, um, and support your work? And then two, what are some resources that you would point people to, point folks to just kind of, hey, if you're starting this journey and you want to learn more, here are some things that really helped me.
Mhm. It feels funny to shift this, like, very deep conversation from all this to be like, "Find me on Instagram," but I am gonna say that, and one reason I'm gonna say find me on Instagram is that I actually did create a restorative justice guide, like resource guide, because people so often will ask me, what can I learn? Where can I learn more about this? And the guide includes organizations all around the world because there's so many people on the ground doing this work, implementing it in powerful, trauma informed, inclusive, creative, heart led ways. So it includes organizations around the world, it includes podcasts, it includes documentaries, it includes books, um, as well as some healing resources specific to trauma, crisis lines, and whatnot. So if people want to find that, I'm frequently updating it. And you could either go to my website, which is my name, Marlee Liss, MarleeLiss.com, or find me on Instagram. It's just Marlee Liss as well. And if you go to the link in my bio, you'll see that resource guide is free and it's immediate access and it's right there. And also, if there's things that listeners are like, I wish you would have this on the guide, you can reach out to me and I'll check it out and I'll add it. I'm also, like I've shared, a speaker, and I'm always very, very honored to do this work. And so, if folks on campuses, at high schools, conferences, organizations, even brands are looking for conversations around healing justice, survivor centered care, as well as violence prevention, because I do that work as well. Specifically around sex ed and LGBTQIA inclusive sex ed. You can definitely check that out on my website as well. And I'm always just happy to hear from people. We're all human beings. So it's always a pleasure to hear from people, whether you have questions, thoughts, comments. And yeah, I just want to say thanks so much to everyone watching and commenting now. And Bobby, you're just incredible. So I feel so grateful to share in this conversation with you. And I always really value when people embody these principles. These are, I'm like, I feel cheesy being like principles, but when people embody these restorative justice principles, I think that's such a huge part of the work that we're talking about. So I'm just celebrating all the ways that you're doing that at your school, in your daily life, and on this platform as well. So thank you so much.
For those who are listening and have not, who are not familiar with Marley, I want to encourage you. Please follow her. Find her on Instagram. Tremendous resources. She does a ton of speaking. For those who are coming from her side and are new, I'd be honored if you gave me a follow here on YouTube, as well as finding me on LinkedIn and some other places. And so, thank you everyone for sharing space with us this evening. And I hope that something resonates with you and you take it with you, that this is the starting of a journey for you into that transformative power of restorative justice. So thank you all for spending time with us, and we'll see you next time.